Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 3rd of February 2014, Blanaid Denman discussed England's hen harriers.
Okay, well, good evening everyone. My name is Blanaid, as has been said, and I work for the RSPB as their Skydancer Engagement Officer or Skydancer Project Officer. Brilliant job title, nobody ever knows what it means. But I will come on to explain exactly what that is in just a little bit. But the reason I'm here tonight is to talk to you about an important part of British wildlife, indeed northeast wildlife, that is slowly disappearing from our doorstep. A part of our wildlife that not many people know anything about. We tend to think of wildlife conservation, wildlife conflicts as something foreign, something that happens elsewhere. So we think of elephants trampling crops in Africa or issues of deforestation in South America. But very seldom do we actually think of wildlife conflicts with kind of man in terms of our own country, our own backyard, when actually, given that we live in an island and ever-increasing people, ever-increasing human population, wildlife is becoming more and more squeezed. And it's a really pertinent issue here. So I'm going to come on to talk about that this evening and hopefully give you a lot of food for thought. Hopefully there'll be a lot of discussion around the issue. But before I kind of introduce that, I thought I'd introduce myself so you can kind of understand a little bit about me and kind of where I'm coming from. So I studied ecology originally, and that's my area of interest. So someone once described ecology as kind of the study of everything. So you think of zoology as animals and botany as plants. Well, ecology is how everything fits together. And for me, that is kind of the essential underlying thing that kind of underpins everything else. Because it's impossible to look at things in isolation. Everything is interconnected, and that's what the study of ecology is. I studied that up in Aberdeen and then did a master's in Leeds on biodiversity and conservation. Like any good student who doesn't know what they want to do, go be a student for a bit longer. And that's what I did. And as part of that, I spent a year working with Birdwatch Ireland, which is the Irish equivalent of the RSPB. I'm from Dublin originally, in case you're trying to place my accent. I've got a very muddled accent, I do apologise. But I spent a year working with Birdwatch Ireland, and as part of that, I was a field worker on the National Red Grouse Survey over there. So I have a particular interest in upland ecology, or more specifically, moorland ecology. My first encounter with the moorlands was as a kid growing up in Dublin. My dad dragging us up into the hills every other Sunday for character building walks. And the Dublin Wicklow Mountains is probably the most continuous area of moorland that exists in Ireland. So very, very familiar, lots of good memories for me. And then acting as kind of a field worker on the National Red Grouse Survey. Red grouse in Ireland, by the way, completely different over here. Here you go up the North York Moors and you're tripping over them. There's probably about 300 or 400 pairs of red grouse in Ireland, the country as a whole. So completely different ecology. And I actually ended up doing my master's thesis on red grouse ecology on Mountain Blanket Bog in Ireland. So that's a bit of a digression, but that is kind of my area of interest. And I'm fascinated by how we influence the landscape and how kind of often multiple seemingly competing factors need to be taken into consideration when it comes to conservation. So I am here to talk to you today about a particular bird, a particular species, the hen harrier. Can I do a quick show of hands? Who's actually heard of a hen harrier before this evening starts? Lots of you. Excellent. Okay. No, that is fantastic. And I say that genuinely because the vast majority of people have never heard of a hen harrier. You say harrier, people think jet. Few people know anything about the bird the jet was named after. But the hen harrier is an integral part of British wildlife. And, you know, RSPB, Royal Society for Protection of Birds, we look out for birds, but we look out for wildlife as a whole. You can't look at things in isolation. nature and context, and it's exactly the same when we're looking at the conservation of hen harriers. So hen harriers, I apologize, it's the first time I've ever done a talk without the use of PowerPoint. So for those listening on podcast, if you go to RSPB website /Skydancer, you can see what a picture of a hen harrier looks like. But for those of you in the audience tonight, I do have some lovely laminates here, which you can look at in the break. But the male and female hen harriers, big bird of prey, a little bit smaller than a buzzard, and absolutely stunning birds. And this is a bird that we should have in the Northumberland Hills. We should have it in the North York Moors and the Peak District. And at the moment, they are sadly missing. The male has had loads of nicknames over the years, so Ghost Bird being one of my favourites. He's very, about just less than a metre wingspan, pale, almost ash grey in colour all over with black wingtips. And you can see totally why he gets that name, Ghost Bird. If you imagine that pale shape gliding across the moors, very ethereal and ghost-like, and absolutely beautiful. The female, very, very different to the male. So brown, mottled brown in colour, very owl-like in expression. I've actually got a pair of puppets, hen harrier puppets, that I use for going into schools. And people always say, oh, I love your owls. And they do, they look very, very like owls, often confused with them. And they've had loads of nicknames over the years as well. Ringtail, for their stripy tail being the most common one. And the female's a little bit bigger than the male, maybe about 1.20 metre wingspan. But they're absolutely stunning birds. And the male hen harrier, another nickname, Skydancer. And that's what the project that I work on is named after. So the Skydancer project is all about raising awareness and promoting the conservation of hen harriers across the north of England, funded by the Heritage Lottery, United Utilities, and supported by the Forestry Commission. And we do talks and things like this, but male hen harriers, skydancing, if you've ever seen the Red Arrow display team, so they're kind of aerial acrobats, that's what these guys are. These guys are like the natural red arrows, proper aerial acrobats. And their courtship display, known as skydancing, in the springtime, they nest on the moors in the long heather, and the male will take to the sky in this absolutely amazing, intricate aerial display, showing off, like males of many species, to the females. And the female, camouflaged for colour, that's why she's so brown, they're adapted to that landscape, nesting on the ground in the long heather. And of course, if you go back into the record books, hen harriers have existed in the UK literally since records began. First ever printed book of British birds, published in 1544, recorded the male hen harrier as native. So this is an integral part of British wildlife. Today, there is one nesting pair of hen harriers in 2012. Last year is the first year since the 1960s we've not had a single successful nest of hen harriers in England. Not one. Now, can we talk about an English population of hen harriers? That's a question I'll leave with you, because hen harriers exist throughout the UK. There's probably around 450 pairs of these birds in Scotland, maybe about 50 pairs or so in Wales, and maybe about 50 pairs in Northern Ireland. But in England, their numbers have been declining steadily over the years. A moorland bird, they nest, as I say, on the ground in the long heather, and being a big bird of prey, they do eat other animals. About 90 to 95% of their diet is made up of small mammals like meadow pipits, like voles, and small birds like meadow pipits and skylarks. But about 5 or 10% of their diet is made up of larger things like young rabbits, wader chicks, and controversially, red grouse. Now, red grouse is a popular game bird. It exists on the heather moors. It eats young heather and it nests in the old stuff. Unlike pheasants, it can't be reared in captivity. So instead, it's managed within the landscape. Now, red grouse is another bird that is unique to the heather moors. It's endemic to the UK and Ireland, so it doesn't exist elsewhere. They fly very fast and bank very hard, so they're quite a popular and well sought after game bird. And hen harriers will occasionally predate young red grouse. So this is seen as a source of conflict, or I say perceived conflict, in some of these areas. around 90%, or the vast majority of moors, heather moors in England, are managed for grouse shooting. Grouse shooting is a long-standing, very traditional way that we use these moorland areas. It first kind of became popular in the it first became popular in kind of the 1800s when Queen Victoria herself took a shine to driven grouse shooting. And Victorian gamekeepers, sadly, were somewhat notorious for cleansing the upland of tooth or claw. And hen harriers bore the brunt of that. So hen harriers were actually driven to extinction on mainland Britain by 1900. They were gone, driven out. They managed to cling on to Orkney and the Northern Isles, a small breeding population, but essentially on the mainland they disappeared. Now fortunately for hen harriers, although less so for the rest of us, 2 successive world wars meant that every young lad with a gun was sent off to fight, and a lot of these moorland areas couldn't be keepered or managed in the same way that they had been previously. And hen harriers were able to reintroduce themselves. They came back naturally to Scotland in around 1938, gradually making their way down south to England and Wales, in the late 50s and 60s. But their population never really recovered. So hen harriers in England have never really gotten above about 20-odd pairs since they reintroduced themselves in the 60s. And they've kind of hovered around then. But in the last 10 years or so, their numbers have plummeted. And as I said, last year was the first year since the 1960s we've not had a single successful nest in England. So this issue of hen harriers taking game birds is one of very real conservation concern at the moment. So there's been many attempts to address this over the years. Hen harriers have been the source of quite a bit of scientific study. So there's a moor just north of the border from England in Scotland called Langham Moor. And it's been the subject of intense study over the last 20 years. First of all, in the 1990s, when the RSPB, along with Natural England, or English Nature as was, the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and the Clew Estates, who own Langham Moor, and Scottish Natural Heritage got together and said, right, let's do some science. There's lots of conjecture. Hen harriers eat loads of grouse. They don't really eat any grouse. Lots of toing and froing, he said, she said. Let's do some science, let's figure out what the actual issue is. What they did was they monitored this moor, they protected the hen harriers on it, they looked at red grouse numbers, and they looked at hen harrier numbers, they looked at the habitat, they looked at hen harrier diet, and they basically just watched what happened. And what happened was that the hen harrier numbers increased exponentially. So they went from 2 pairs at the start of the project to 14 pairs by year 4 to 22 pairs the year after the project had finished. Now, nobody anticipated that kind of exponential increase. And what happened was they did have a significant impact on the number of grouse available to shoot. They didn't impact on the breeding population, but they did have an effect. They were basically taking the place of the grouse shooters. So the grouse shooters coming in and taking off the excess birds that in a natural system would have otherwise migrated out. And the hen harriers were doing what comes naturally to predators and creaming off those excess birds. But it meant that grouse shooting wasn't viable there. Now, there were 5 other moors in that study that were also monitored for grouse numbers and hen harrier numbers. And that same problem didn't happen on those other moors. We didn't get the same exponential increase, and there wasn't the same intense impact on the number of grouse. So exactly why that happened on Langham Moor is a subject of some debate. But what we can take from that is that in certain circumstances, hen harriers can have an impact on the number of birds available to shoot. So, fast forward, and there's more studies going on at Langham now, looking at ways to manage that conflict. So using techniques like diversionary feeding, which is effectively a bird table for harriers. You've got a little podium, T-bar, on which researchers use day-old poultry chicks and white rats, because for them they can see what's being taken into the nest. But there's a gamekeeper up in Scotland who uses scraps of venison from deer culled in the estate, costs him nothing, takes 10 minutes out of his day, and it works. Where it's been trialled at Langham, it's been shown to be almost, not quite, 100% effective in reducing the number of grouse being taken into the nest. So we've got a real practical solution there that works. But what you've got, in addition to kind of trying to find practical solutions, is trying to find cultural solutions as well. So red-grey shooting is, well, there's two forms of red-grey shooting, really. There's driven shooting, which is the prevalent one, and there's walked-up shooting. So walked-up shooting might be what you consider traditional kind of hunting. So a couple of guys and their dogs up over the moor, shooting whatever they happen to flush. Low intensity in terms of the management that goes into those moors, and low intensity in terms of the number of birds taken out of it. Driven shooting is where you might have 7 to 9 shooters or guns in a line across the moor in hides, which are known as butts, and another team of people called beaters, starting from up to a mile away, drive the birds towards the waiting guns, so beating the heather as they go, hence the name driven shooting. It's much more intensive in terms of the management that's needed, so you need a lot more grouse for it to be viable, and it's more intensive in terms of the number of birds taken out of it. It's very difficult to talk about what an average day's shoot is, because shooting, like farming, has a whole spectrum. So, you can't talk about an average farm because you might have everything from, a small-scale guy with a couple of heads of cattle and a hay field or two, right through up to industrial-sized, massive mechanized fields, combine harvesters and all sorts. And shooting's the same. You might have a grouse moor where you've got small-scale, he doesn't employ a gamekeeper, just does a bit of predator control himself, and buddies go up and do a bit of shooting there, on rough shooting on the odd occasion, through to big industrial scale intensive driven moors where you might have 100 grouse shot on a day shoot and everything in between. So I use the term kind of average day shoot with a bit of trepidation for that reason. But you have this culture on the extreme end, that really intensive end, whereby any loss of grouse is seen as a bad thing to predators. So put yourself in a gamekeeper's shoes. Here's a guy who not only is his job tied up with providing enough birds to be able to shoot, but often his house, his car, the school his kids go to. There's intense pressure on him to make sure that there's enough game birds there to be shot. And if you've got a bird of prey coming in and picking them off, how is he going to feel about that? On the other hand, hen harriers have the highest level of legal protection, not just nationally under UK law, but internationally as well, under European law. They're Schedule 1 under the European Birds Directive. It's an offence to intentionally or recklessly harm, kill, endanger, disturb the birds, the eggs, the nests, the chicks, anything like that. So you can see how things start to get a bit difficult. Hen harriers, unfortunately, are the subject of illegal persecution, something that should have died out with the Victorians. This is something that's going on. We know it's happening. At the moment, in fact, as I'm standing here talking to you now, there is a man up in court in Aberdeenshire on charges connected with the death of a hen harrier. This isn't something that's consigned to the history books. It's something that's still happening. And it's a very, very difficult thing to quantify because hen harriers live in remote upland areas. The chances of somebody being there and seeing what happens if an illegal act happens, the chances of somebody being in the right place at the right time to catch that act happening are so, so slim. So to talk about prosecutions is a very difficult thing. How do you quantify what kind of illegal persecution is happening? We know it's happening because we have evidence, again, like your man up in Aberdeenshire at the moment, but a very well-publicised example would be Blanaid Betty. Has anyone heard of Blanaid Betty? No? One or two of you. Grand. Well, Betty was a hen harrier chick. And the Forest of Blanaid over in Lancashire is a renowned place for hen harriers. The Forest of Blanaid AONB, or Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, literally has hen harrier as its logo. So the image of a hen harrier is on every fence and gatepost around there. But we've not had any successful hen harriers nesting there since 2011. So even where hen harriers were doing badly elsewhere in England, they always did well in the Forest of Blanaid until recently. And that decline is a product of the wider decline. It's not because things have changed in Blanaid necessarily. It's because of a product of the wider decline. But Betty, fledged in 2011, was one of the last chicks to fledge from the Forest of Bowland. And we satellite tagged her, RSPB in Natural England. And it was fascinating to see where she went. We still don't understand a lot about where hen harriers go outside of the breeding season. So they nest in the uplands, but in the winter, they tend to move out of the uplands to lowland coastal areas. The Northumberland coast is a great place actually to see them. And they find these traditional winter roosting spots and bed down with maybe between 2 and 10 harriers, marsh harriers, short-eared owls, sometimes merlin, other birds of prey. And that's where they spend their winters. And they move around. We know Scottish birds come down to England. Some birds in the west come over to the east. They go absolutely all over the place. And Betty was a perfect example of that. So having fledged in Bowland, she spent the winter in the North Pennines and the Yorkshire Dales, came back to Bowland, went up to the borders for a bit, early springtime, came back down south, thought, nah, like the Scots better, went all the way up to Forcenard in Inverness, hung about there for a few weeks, and then came back down. Absolutely fascinating to watch. What was driving her making all those travels all over the country? I don't think we'll ever fully understand. But ultimately, in July of 2012, her satellite tag stopped. And when researchers went in to recover it, they found that Betty had been shot on the edge of a grouse moor in the Yorkshire Dales. We know she was shot. We have forensic evidence to say that she had been shot through the leg. But because she was shot through the leg, she would have bled to death, most likely. So she could have flown for several miles before she eventually succumbed to her injury. We will never know where she was shot. We will never know who shot her. There will never be a prosecution, and there will never be any charges brought. So to talk about illegal persecution in terms of the number of court cases, the number of prosecutions, is a complete misleading thing. We know this is happening. Now, hen harriers are very divisive. Some people will say that there is no place for them in the uplands. I was at a West Cumbria game fair, not last summer, but the summer before. And on the same day, 2 different people, same event, came up to me, 2 different quotes. One, hen harrier or vermin. I'm sorry, they just don't have a place here anymore. You have a choice. You can have hen harriers and other birds of prey, or you can have lapwing and curlew and all this other wonderful wildlife that we are so, struggling to protect. They are not compatible. You cannot have both. Very, very set in his mindset. I had another person come up to me on the same day and say, all gamekeepers are evil. They just want to kill things. You're wasting your time trying to talk to them. Don't bother. They're only out to try and get rid of anything with tooth or claw. They have absolutely no interest. They're bloody-minded. Don't try and talk to them. Grouse shooting should be banned. Now, you can't get 2 more extreme viewpoints than that, can you? And hen harriers, I've never encountered a species that have the ability to evoke such a visceral reaction in people. It's fascinating. And I don't happen to agree with either of those viewpoints, but perhaps you do. Maybe you think that grouse shooting should be banned. Maybe you think that actually, do you know what? Our countryside is getting smaller and smaller, and maybe there isn't place for large predators like this anymore. That's a question I'll kind of leave hanging with you. But ultimately, we all have to share this island. And somehow you've got to not only try and accommodate wildlife like hen harriers and activities like grouse shooting, but we use them more for so many other things. Walking, bird watching, fell running, mountain biking. It's where most of our water comes from. It's one of the biggest carbon sinks that we have. So actually, moorland, not many people realize this, moorland landscape, that habitat is globally rarer than rainforest. 75% of the world's quota of moorland habitat exists in the UK, right on our doorstep, yet this is something that we kind of just take for granted. And it's also, per unit area, it's a better carbon sink than rainforest. So there's whole ways that we depend on that landscape, even without thinking about it. And if you're going to talk about conservation, you need to try and figure out how we marry up all of those different elements. Hen harriers are disappearing from England. We have maybe about 450 pairs up in Scotland, none bred in England this year. Some would say that they are functionally extinct in England. Now, extinct, that's a really powerful word and a very emotive word. And you have to ask, how can you justify the use of that? Now, as an ecologist, I could say, well, functionally extinct means a population that is no longer viable. So there might be birds there, but if they're not breeding, that population is eventually going to die out. Functionally, it's as good as extinct. But can we talk about an English population? I've just mentioned how hen harriers move around so much in the winter. Is it possible to say they're extinct in England? Is that a valid statement? Or do we look at the wider UK population and say, well, okay, there's 450 pairs up in Scotland. In Scotland, they're facing the same issues in southern and eastern Scotland as we're facing in England when it comes to grouse shooting, this kind of perceived conflict, that it's not possible to have hen harriers and grouse shooting together, that it has to be an either or choice, that it's one or the other. In northwest Scotland, they're doing well. There isn't as much grouse shooting up there. And of course, I should qualify, that hen harriers, grouse shooting, and this conflict isn't the only reason that hen harriers can encounter, that can die. Obviously, they're a ground nesting bird, and there are issues with ground predation and natural death. Of course there are. But this is really at the heart of it. There was an independent government report published in 2011 by the JNCC called the Hen Harrier Framework, which stated there's enough habitat in England for around 320 pairs, or over 320 pairs of hen harriers. The pairs that are breeding are managing to breed well enough or producing enough chicks that by all rights the population should be expanding. So the only logical conclusion as to why it's not is direct human intervention or persecution. So it's not an RSPB that said, it's not RSPB that said that, it's not another wildlife organisation that said that, that's an independent government report that has made that conclusion. So we do know that that is, persecution is the main issue. But is it helpful to talk about persecution? For centuries, and more so recently, there's been this us and them attitude between conservationists and the shooting community. Can we consider those two things separate identities? I mean, people who are involved in shooting do so because they love the countryside, they love being out there, and they enjoy and want to see that area, those moorland spaces looked after as much as we do. So can we say that they are not part of the conservation community? This us and them attitude, is that helpful? People dig themselves into their own trenches, become more entrenched in their viewpoints. Do we need to try and find somewhere in the middle? Can we? Is it possible to find a middle ground? These are all questions that I'm deliberately not answering. That's what we're here tonight to have a good chat and hopefully discussion about. But I'll leave you with this thought. Hen harriers are legally protected in this country. We talk about, rhinos in Africa or, orangutans in Southeast Asia, and we say, oh God, isn't it terrible that these species are disappearing? Yet here we have one of our largest and most charismatic species on our doorstep that is slowly dwindling away. Despite legal protection, do we have a moral obligation to look after them? I mean, hen harriers do exist outside of the UK. They exist throughout Europe. Is it okay to let them disappear here? Does it really matter? I'll leave you with that.
Cafe North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.